Before I begin, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the two elephants and two donkeys. These four presidents right here are the most recent four. I'm not including them on the list, and here's why. In terms of what I factor into this list, I'm only going by their administration. Not before, not after, but during their administration. Personality also does not really mean anything unless it directly impacts how they ran their government. Plenty of nice guys have screwed up after all, but I'm also factoring in legacy. That does not mean what did people do after their president. It means how did they impact the country with what they did as time went on. Did they change things for the good or the bad? The problem with these modern four presidents is that we won't fully know what their legacy is until much later. It's too recent. Some presidents start off being remembered well, then bad, then good again, and then bad, and so on. Hindsight is 2020. We learn about some things later on. And of course, the standards on what makes a good or bad president or leader changes over time. So I'm not including these four on the list, as much as I would really like to include three of them. Have fun figuring that out. I also want to point out that this list isn't partisan based. People from four different political parties make this list. I'd also like to point out that being liberal or being conservative doesn't inherently put them on the list either. I focus on different things. Did their policies benefit the people as a whole? Did they follow the Constitution or did they try to break it? Did they have a particular project or policy that was a waste of time and money? More importantly, if there's a sudden change in the situation or if there's a huge emergency, are they willing to be flexible in order to solve the problem? I guarantee you that everyone will see someone on this list that'll really piss them off that I included them, but don't see an inclusion of a Democrat or a Republican on this list as me being biased towards liberalism or conservatism. So things like taxation or how patriotic they are don't mean anything to me or my list unless it directly contributed to a problem or solution they had. It's impossible to remove 100% bias. No one can, but I'm going to try to do the best I can. Okay? Okay. So let's start this list with a tie for 10th place. Number 10, a tie between Richard Nixon and Woodrow Wilson. These are interesting choices to be sure. When I rank things for a list like this, I want to consider the good things and bad things a president has done. Ultimately, while some people think that one bad act can instantly erase good things they've done, I tend to do more of a balancing scale type thing. So let's start with Nixon. The Watergate scandal is really bad. There's just no way around it. Even though he didn't do the crime itself, he knew about it, covered it up, and lied about it, and resigned right before they planned to try and impeach him. He was also corrupt. His appointing of Henry Kissinger led to pointless government-topping regimes, bombing of innocent civilians, and I'd honestly argue ones that should be classified as war crimes that they got away with. He was also very much against freedom of the press, attempting to use government power to silence them, which is not only unconstitutional, but just another example of corruption in general. So why is he not at least in the bottom three? He actually did some good things that can't be overlooked. For one thing, he made the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a good thing. This is before idiots in Washington around 20 years ago decided that apparently preserving the Earth is a partisan issue and not a humanity issue. So apparently adding regulations to make sure we don't lose the attributes of the planet that keeps us alive and healthy is partisan and controversial, and frankly that's stupid. So good on Nixon for actually being willing to see through that and implement the EPA anyway. He also passed other acts which in the long term went a long way, even if they're being screwed over in the current administration. What about Woodrow Wilson? Sure, he led us through World War I and proposed the League of Nations, which, while that was a failure, was at least well-intentioned, right? Intentions don't mean as much here as the consequences. Also, while women got voting rights under his administration, it's not because of Wilson. He delayed even publicly supporting it because he was worried about re-election and losing the Southern vote. He also did the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which horribly broke the First Amendment over freedom of speech and press. If you were anti-British or critical of Wilson's administration or something like that in any way, you'd better watch out. Also, he enforced segregation in the armed forces actively. While he didn't start it, he kept openly insisting it was to their benefit. He also attempted to further segregate civil service positions and implement nationwide Jim Crow laws in that regard. He also said that was for their benefit too. Wilson is a very overrated president. Sorry. Number 9. Ulysses S. Grant. I really hate including this guy. I really do. He's so wonderful as a person. Even ignoring the fact that he's a war hero who did what was necessary, I still hate including him here. Grant's administration is the perfect example of a person having a good heart but not doing a good job. at all. He really wanted Reconstruction to work out. He wanted the freed slaves to attain equal rights and respect that they deserved. He wanted to stop groups like the KKK from lynching people, but he just couldn't run a government well. His administration had a lot of corruption problems as well. But it's safe to say that it wasn't because Grant was a corrupt guy so much as that he didn't know what he was doing, and so he couldn't see what was happening around him. Again, this is over administration and not someone's intentions, so I really have to put Grant on this list. Number 8, Ronald Reagan. Oh, a lot of you are going to hate me for this. Remember, he's not here for being conservative. No, Reagan is here for other things like the Iran-Contra scandal, where he sold arms to extremist Iran to make illegal money in which he gave to a dictator in Central America, funding groups like the future Al-Qaeda and Taliban because they were being a nuisance for the Soviet Union. Oops. The war on drugs, which was a waste of money, jailed too many innocent people, and is essentially the same as prohibition in that by restricting substances, especially addictive ones, you caused the rise of gang activity and merely made the market go underground, making things a million times worse, not to mention the tons of taxpayer money that was wasted on it. Ultimately, it was a huge failure. Escalating the Cold War after a period of détente, which caused a huge increase in military spending when we really didn't need it, especially when he was trying to cut back on spending a little bit. This ended up making a lot of deficits. He horribly handled the AIDS epidemic and let it grow too large before even doing anything about it. And then there's the savings and loan crisis. You get the picture. Reagan is a nice guy, even a decent actor, but I feel he's overrated and nowhere near being perfect. Sorry, guys. Number 7. John Tyler. William Henry Harrison dies after a short time in this office. John Tyler succeeds him, and he ends up somehow being a million times worse. He was elected on a certain platform, and he simply didn't follow it. It's easy to understand that politicians never follow their promises all the time, or to the fullest extent, but John Tyler pulled a ton of 180s. Heck, he was even kicked out by his own party, ending his term as an independent candidate instead of a Whig. He constantly vetoed legislation, making everyone his enemy. Overall, other than the annexation of Texas, his administration accomplished practically nothing of importance. Heck, his entire administration, he was nicknamed His Accidency. Oh yeah, and of course he ignored the slavery problem. One could argue that he was merely standing up for principles, and that's admirable, and that's why he vetoed everything. And in a way that does make him a bit different than someone who just blocks everything for nothing. But I'd argue there's a difference between doing it over moral issues like human rights, freedom of speech, or something of that magnitude, but this wasn't over those things. This was mainly over how the government spent its money, which, while it's an important issue, it's not something that magically puts John Tyler in a new light. They weren't spending money on weapons of mass destruction or toppling regimes. He wasn't opposing people making themselves lavishly rich off of taxpayer money. This was over things like building roads and banks and schools. You also have to understand that while the veto is an important and necessary power of a president for a balanced government, he was the first person to have overused it. Number 6. Millard Fillmore. So, for the second time in a row, a Whig president dies early and the vice president succeeding them is worse. You should see my video on the Whig Party to learn more about that. Anywho, this president made the issue of slavery tenser with the Compromise of 1850. It once again weakened the Missouri Compromise and made the issue of slavery ever so closer to civil war. While he wasn't as obstructionist as Tyler, he was somehow less effective. There's really not much else to say here. Moving on. Number 5. Herbert Hoover. Hear me out, before you say anything. The Great Depression isn't the only reason why he's this low. I promise you, just hear me out. Yes, the Great Depression, or at least his handling of it, does land him on this list. But that alone is not worthy for him being in the bottom 5. It's really not. That might put him at 8 or 9. But Hoover is also just a screw up with his policies in other ways too. There's the Bonus Army incident of 1932. Basically, World War I veterans were promised payment in 1924 for their services. If you know anything about veterans, you know that it's not always easy for them when they return from a war. It's just not. They need help and they deserve it for fighting for their country. So naturally, during the Depression, when unemployment is at an all-time high, these soldiers still have not been paid. They decide to march on Washington, D.C. to demand the thing that they were promised 4 years ago. General Douglas MacArthur, yes, that MacArthur, thought that they were a part of a communist uprising and sent in the military to force them out, resulting in the injuries of hundreds of civilians. Yes, completely stupid, I know, but I'm not blaming Hoover for that. In fact, Hoover actually ordered MacArthur not to attack them, but he ignored the order and did it anyway. Hoover's problem was that he didn't fire him. He just shrugged it off and said, "Oh, that Douglas never listening to orders," and tried to pretend that it didn't happen. When you're a leader, you're responsible for the people under your management, and when they screw up and aren't reprimanded or fired, that's a problem. Hoover also did mass deportations that ended up mostly being actual citizens of the United States as opposed to illegal immigrants. Oops. Oh, and Hoover was also against federal laws against lynching people. What? Why? Okay, look. Hoover has done some good humanitarian work. Also some ones where he really screwed up, but he still did some good things. Too bad those were all before and after his administration, so they don't count for this list. Number 4, Franklin Pierce. So you're noticing that several people on this list are here because they didn't do much to stop the Civil War from happening. Franklin Pierce is once again continuing this pattern. By the 1850s, tensions are at an all-time high. The time for compromise is nearing an end. Past compromises have simply failed to solve the slavery issue. When it's at that point, the last thing you should do is avoid the problem. Franklin Pierce actively remained neutral on the surface while actually being pro-slavery for his entire administration, which essentially forced Congress to handle most of the issue during his administration. When Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, one of the worst acts of all time, he signed it into effect. This act undid the Missouri Compromise, caused Kansas to become bleeding Kansas and break out in its own mini-civil war that preceded the big Civil War by a few years. He also advocated for more territorial expansion, even if through arms if necessary, at a time where every new state caused a national crisis over the slavery issue. He even supported a pro-slavery regime change in Nicaragua, hoping maybe that'd help his expansionist cause. Theodore Roosevelt called him a servile tool of men worse than himself, ever ready to do any work the slavery leaders set him. He was right, but hey, at least he bought that area that would give us Tucson, Arizona, right? Number 3, Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding was elected in 1920 by a huge margin. He campaigned on a return to normalcy, following the tremendous involvement in World War I. Well, tremendous by American standards at least. Why is this guy so low? Well, he's a very corrupt man. The most famous scandal of his administration is the Teapot Dome scandal. Basically, to sum it up, the U.S. Navy had its own special reserves of oil. You kind of need oil for your ships. Harding's administration essentially decided to secretly transfer those sources of oil to private oil companies after lots of secret bribing. Granted, America wasn't going into war anytime soon, especially so soon after World War I, but why would you just potentially ruin your Navy's supply of oil like that? What if the company screwed up and shut down? What about the tax money used to maintain it that the public paid for without realizing it was not even being handled by the government? Oh, and did I mention bribes? While Harding himself didn't do this scandal, he still appointed these people despite knowing already that some of them were corrupt, as well as the fact that he never fired them from office, meaning he was either okay with it or really ignorant. If he was ignorant on how a government-held supply of oil for the entire Navy exchanged hands and was unaware of money being transferred for it, then that's quite an accounting problem. However, we do know that Harding at the very least approved of the handover. Any records of his knowledge on bribes is unknown. But one of his administration's members, future President Herbert Hoover, notably asked Harding if there was any truth into some of the corruption rumors going around involving his cabinet members. Harding was reportedly always silent and never answered that question. So take that for what you will. He also weirdly supported veterans by making a Veterans Bureau, but then when Congress proposed a pension bill for World War I, which would lead to the Bonus Army incident later, the first time around he vetoed it, which is kind of a dick move. Harding thought veterans were already being supported, so we don't need to do it. Also, surprise, surprise, the head of Harding's Bureau of Veterans Affairs was sent to jail for fraudulent use of government money. Ultimately, Harding was more concerned with avoiding a scandal instead of doing the right thing and halting this corruption when he could have done it by firing them and appointing better people. He died in office in 1923, and these scandals became known to the public, rightfully eroding the view of his presidency. Number 2, James Buchanan. I know, I'm as surprised as you. For the longest time, this guy was going to be number 1, but I delegated him to number 2, but just barely. If there was a score assigned to these guys, just assume the difference between Buchanan and number 1 is just by 1 point. Buchanan, despite being number 2 on my list, is often number 1 on many lists. It's a perfectly reasonable choice. There's just no way around it. The Civil War broke out around him and he did nothing. He did say secession was illegal, but he also thought the U.S. Army stopping them was also illegal. So he literally just paced around the White House saying he was the final president of the United States, convinced it was going to be the end. He also did nothing over the Bleeding Kansas fiasco, which was essentially a mini civil war inside Kansas. Just leave it to the states and they'll magically solve it themselves without any problem. That didn't quite work. Great job, Buchanan. Instead, he focused on trying to acquire Cuba and maybe more of northern Mexico. He thought about buying Alaska so he could send Mormons there. Yes, it's true. Look it up. He essentially focused on pointless hypothetical expansion when the nation was literally falling apart in front of him. Before I get to number 1, here are some dishonorable mentions. LBJ. A lot of good domestic policies. Also, the Civil Rights Act was great. But he is also responsible for the heavy involvement in Vietnam, and we all know what a fiasco that was. I was tempted to have that factor alone make him appear somewhere on this list, but his good features outweigh his bad features ultimately. William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor. Ineffective and didn't do much to help the slavery issue, but ultimately their terms are too short, so I can't reasonably include them on this list. It wouldn't be fair. And now, the worst president in U.S. history, excluding potential modern presidents, is number 1, Andrew Johnson. Again, I'd like to emphasize that this guy is barely worse than Buchanan. If Buchanan screwed up preventing the Civil War swiftly, Andrew Johnson screwed up the aftermath. Here's my argument why Johnson is worse than Buchanan. I'd argue that the American Civil War was inevitable. Yes, Buchanan and many others screwed it up or helped it get here sooner, but if he wasn't elected, the Civil War still would have happened. Heck, if Fremont would have won in 1856 over Buchanan, then we'd have an earlier Civil War. Buchanan deserves all the credit for messing up and not doing anything when it broke out, but at least it was inevitable someone would mess up. Johnson ruined half of the accomplishments of the Civil War itself. The Civil War was a bloody war in which hundreds of thousands died. It resulted in a firmer union, the ending of American slavery, and finally ended the one thing clogging American political progress for the past 50 years. But we all know that just because these things happened, that does not mean it was all a happy ending for the freed slaves right away. Johnson is to blame for quite a lot of this. Here's how Johnson screwed up Reconstruction. A bill to make freed slaves citizens of the United States like was hoped and promised? Vetoed. Civil Rights Act where all the freed slaves are treated equally under the law? Vetoed. Why? Because as he put it, they unfairly advantaged African Americans. Wow. Eventually, amendments guaranteeing these things would pass anyway, but he stalled these things and essentially let the South off easy. When southern states began implementing Jim Crow laws and black codes that restricted the civil rights of black people even after these amendments passed, he did nothing to stop them. Keep in mind, this was also when soldiers were still occupying the South and haven't left yet, so he easily could have. He dragged his heels in every single way he could, and it led to him being impeached. The first president to be impeached, and only 1 out of 2, but losing conviction only by 1 vote. After all the blood that shed during the Civil War, after working to end slavery, the idea that all men were created equal, after Lincoln literally died for his country by being assassinated while in office, Johnson goes meh and actively makes sure that the war is fought for nothing by letting the South get away with Jim Crow laws and setting back Reconstruction for years. He essentially set back civil rights by several years as well. He is without a doubt the worst president in U.S. history. Oh, okay, I guess if you still think it's Buchanan, that's fine too, but Johnson deserves this spot in my opinion. So yeah, that was my opinion on the top 10 worst presidents. Was there anyone I left off that you felt should be included? Would you like to make your own list? Would you like to criticize one of my choices? Feel free to do so in the comments, but remember, this list is my opinion. Don't take it too seriously. And you voted for this anyway, so you had it coming to you. So I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I will see you guys next time.